Lawyers who read wills to families. What is the most interesting, bizarre, offensive, surprising thing you have had to read out loud? One of my former bosses was getting up in age and had no children. One day we were discussing family history and he mentioned how he still had the old family Bible his grandparents brought over from Germany, with the whole family tree handwritten into it, which I thought was an amazing thing to have. But he went on to lament that when he died it was going to have to go to his ungrateful, good-for-nothing niece since the old rules of inheritance said she should get it, even though he knew she didn't care a thing about the family history. Several of us involved in the discussion tried to convince him that there had to be some other family member that would give it the respect it deserved, or barring that, a historical society that would know what to do with it. But he would have none of it, since that just isn't the way it is done. Years later I thought of this while attending his funeral and tried to figure out who was that niece, maybe in hopes of broaching the subjects with her, but never could. I still wonder about it sometimes and hope, for his sake, that it ended up in good hands. Lawyer here. Not a thing with reading the will, just my favorite. Testator, dying guy, wanted to leave bequests to pretty much everybody he had known who was still living. In 3 countries, 1% to this guy, 2% to that lady. Then he kept changing his mind about one beneficiary or the other, which required the development of a spreadsheet to recalculate all the other bequests whenever he would change that guy's gift from 1% to 1.5%. Fortunately for sanity it was a pot of cash. If he had changed physical bequests, half my spoons to my cousin Lydia, the other half, no, 5/8, we would have had to kill him. There is one famous device in a will from New York. A rich man left everything to his wife, provided she remarried. The will supposedly had the explanation that the testator put this condition on the will because he wanted to make sure at least one person truly mourned his death. I bequeath all my property to my wife on the condition that she remarry immediately. Then there will be at least one man to regret my death. Heinrich Heine, 1797 to 1856, German poet, journalist and literary critic, said on his deathbed, not in his will I think. Title examiner here. I once read a will where the dissident left his presumably gay son the 12 feet of rope in my tool shed, so the F can do us all a favor and hang himself. His words, not mine. There are some truly terrible people in this world. What a horrific man. An ancestor of mine in the rural UK in the 1700s died and left his farm and everything to his nephew. No children, with his surviving wife only getting the second best bed and a provision her to receive £3 of butter per week for the rest of her life. We thought this was incredibly mean, but we wonder whether this butter was meant as an income. I mean, who can eat £3 of butter? On behalf of my dad here, he one time had a woman leave millions of dollars to 3 stray cats that she had been feeding and he had to go catch them and put them in crates to be shipped to Texas where they live a life of luxury in a cat resort. Another guy had a safety deposit box that was massive, like the size of a small dresser. Inside it was filled with coins that they had to count. Turns out it was several $100,000 worth of coins. Me and my wife went to a lawyer to have our wills drafted. The lawyer told us of a client he had that had a great deal of money. His kids were fighting over it before he was dead. The man liked the monkey exhibit in the local zoo. He liked to just watch them all the time. When he died, the lawyer had to tell his family he willed all of his money and estate to the zoo for the monkey exhibits. He now has a bench dedicated to his honor at one of the local zoos. He said they were livid and tried to fight. Lesson is don't be petty and greedy, love your family unconditionally. He know how a bench dead over is to his honor. Can you please take another shot at this sentence? I'm actually really interested in this story and would like to know what he know a bench dead of over is in his honor. Years ago, worked in a retirement community. Older man we knew was gay developed a late in life relationship and moved into the community with his gay lover. He was a career vet, multiple honors, a wall of medals. He was also a bit off in butthole most days, but he had moments over a meal. His stories were fantastic. His children over 3 years never once visited him. He had a heart attack and knew he was going to die. His children showed up but demanded his lover leave for visits. In his will he left everything to his lover and his lover's one child from a former marriage. He wrote a long note about his kids' hypocrisy of not visiting, and their attitudes toward his lover. He left each of his 2 kids a pail of coal ash to be deducted from his estate, had his estate pay for his lover's plot to be next to him and his wife, and in his long letter that his kids, if they visited him in his death, would be reminded of why they didn't visit while he was alive. It was, frankly, awesome hearing his kids blow up about it. My sister spent a couple years working for a long-standing organization in Philly that's been accepting bequeathments since the late 18th century. Her job was to help organize the various trusts they had to administer, as well as going around advising people not to do things like this, and just leave them a lump sum. People had a habit of leaving them an annual trust. That $5 a year was a princely sum in 1813, but by now it's just a complete nuisance. Or of leaving them ridiculously specific things to do every year. The worst example I remember, I'm a little fuzzy on the details, was a woman who left funds to purchase books for schoolchildren in Liberia. The problem is, her funds now don't buy more than a couple books, and she left instructions for someone to deliver the books, not to ship them. A delivery driver is someone. 3. When my grandparents on my mother's side were dying of cancer, my uncle, black sheep, piece of crap of the family who I've never met, thank God, wanted to know what he was getting from the inheritance when they died. Not how's mom and dad or what can I do to help. My grandparents, being the people they were still going to give him an inheritance after all the fricked up things he did to them, but my mom, the power of attorney, convinced them that they shouldn't be manipulated by him anymore. They ended up writing him an email back telling him that he wouldn't be included in the will anymore. He ended up threatening to burn their house down, my house down, killing me and my family etc. for betraying him. And you know what my grandparents did? They ended up including him in the will and sending him exactly 1 penny in check form by mail. That was the last time I have heard from him since. I work for a brokerage firm and I often deal with account beneficiaries. We had a client leave his entire account to a stripper. After the client died, his wife discovered her husband had left his life savings to Jean Sparkles Smith. She was really P. Lawyer here. We normally don't actually do a reading of the will here like they do in the movies. It's much more boring. We just fire up the probate and send notice to all the heirs. The weirdest one I saw was a guy that was worth about $2 million who left my car a jacket and $1 to my son. I hope it keeps him warm when he winds up sleeping under a bridge. The kid had a drug issue. I also had someone leave an antique commode to one of his kids. Yes, he considered an elderly toilet to be a family heirloom. The guy was actually pretty excited to get the toilet. It was the last thing they had left to remember their grandma by. I crap you not. Pun intended. A friend had 2 sisters when their father passed away. Their mom had died in their childhood. Anyway, years go by and the oldest daughter is the only one who keeps in contact with the father for various reasons. Dude was an abusive dong, played favorites, all of that crap. Older sister was obviously the favorite as she got everything. The other daughter and son, my friend, got $1 apiece. Oldest sister could have been a dong about it but decided to be bro status. They all sat down to dinner on a night and big sister was like, listen, dad left me all of this. It was a pretty sizable amount of money. She could have taken it and lived comfortably without working till the day she died. Maybe. Definitely. If she managed the money proper. She sat down with her little brother and sister and was like, 3 ways even? Deal. End of it. You all would think that you would do the same for your brother, sister, best friend, whatever. You'd be surprised what people are really like when money is involved. Even a small amount of it. Fricked up. Not in this case though. I am not a lawyer but I am deputy public administrator and we find wills often. We deal with individuals who died without any known family or the family is estranged and we have to locate them. One of the wills I read said no fricking lawyers in the text and another one stated I would like crack powder stuffed in my ears and cremated. I'm a trust attorney. I can't tell you how many times the surviving spouse from a blended marriage cuts out the stepkids. They always try to justify it to me even though I really don't care. I'm not there to judge. Los Angeles residents are especially concerned about their pets. I've written trust where the pets inherit more than the kids. It's always awkward when I have to tell a child they were disinherited. No easy way to tell a person that. I'm not a lawyer, but my family has an odd story involving a will. Several generations back, a woman, along with her brothers, in our family inherited a huge sum of money from her father, oil money in Oklahoma. At the time, women were allowed to inherit property assets if single, but all assets would have been transferred to her husband if she married. She wasn't too happy about the situation and, in protest, never took a husband. She had a few friends over the course of her life and lived a very comfortable life until dying of old age, at which time, her estate was divided amongst all of the female descendants in the family. TL. DNR. My great aunt of something was a bad but feminist B. My office has had two notably bizarre estates. The first, the mother stipulated in her will that one of her sons was not to receive his portion of her estate until he went to a dentist. The second stipulated that her two cats were to be euthanized upon her death and cremated with her. I just remembered another, though it was in preparation of an older lady's will. She wanted it in there for her to be buried next to her late husband on the family property. He had died a few years before her, had to question whether his body or ashes are buried on the property, neither of which are particularly legal. Never got a firm answer from her. Growing up, my brother and I played rock, paper, scissors over every little thing. My dad wanted the will to have if both him and mom died together to have me and my brother play one hand of rock, paper, scissors for everything. My father is an heir to the Procter & Gamble company. Just so we are clear, I am not rich. Anyway, my grandfather was adopted with his brother by two spinster sisters, part of the P&G family, had an elevator in his house, the whole 9 yards. My grandfather went to the war, was part of the Battle of the Bulge and came back completely shell-shocked. He began drinking and partying, etc. When the sisters died, everything was left to his brother, assuming my grandfather would drink away the money. My grandfather was left a small general store to support his family, a small home and a car. He cleaned up his act and sought counseling when they figured out PTSD, and his brother gave him nothing and never spoke to him after he was better. The brother once purposely crossed the street so he would not have to speak to my father, his nephew. Not a lawyer, but happened with my family. My grandfather-in-law's daughter tried to change his will without him knowing about it. After he passed, they were all gathered at the wedding. The only thing he left her was a really nice bronze sculpture of the devil, or Pan, playing the flute. I worked with trusts and estates for many years. One of my favorites was from a widower whose wife had died some 20 years earlier. After her death, he wanted to travel the country in a motorhome but was too grieved to do so. Years later, his old army buddy's wife died and they re-established their friendship in their retirement years. He finally bought the motorhome he'd dreamed of and left with his buddy to travel the continent, which they did for many years. After he passed away, he left a new motorhome to his buddy, but with one stipulation. The buddy was required to mount a set of 6-foot longhorns on the hood of the rig before it would become his. It sounded like a Texan versus non-Texan dispute they'd had for many years. Absolutely brilliant, and seemed like an amazing friendship. I would have loved to hear their traveling adventures over the years. I just remembered he'd also left his sister just 2 cents and to tell her that he would finally get his 2 cents in. My uncle left his business to his sister and never updated the will after he got married and had kids. They had an old water cooler he had taken from his office back to his home when it was replaced. His sister came to the wake to pick it up as it was still, technically, belonging to the business. What a total C. The issue here was that a will needs to be a regularly updated document. The story was about the estranged sister and a lack of legal framework protecting the family in the case of an antiquated will in the country on question. Well, my father's an attorney, not an estate attorney, but anyway, in my boyfriend's living will, he has instructions that his ashes be shot out of a cannon. Not living will, that's a different thing. Premium marriage material. A friend of mine is a lawyer. He had one client who, in accordance with his will, which contained the permits to do so, had his entire estate burned while his family watched. It sounds cold, but apparently the guy died from a fairly easily treatable cancer as he ran out of money and his relatives would not help. I work in an enormous courthouse where people often ask any guy in a suit, "Are you a lawyer?" I was on the probate floor and a very attractive lady in her late 40s asked me that question. She proceeded to tell me that she was there because her dead boyfriend had forgotten her in his will despite his many promises. His wife and kids had, believe it or not, gotten all his money, again, despite his numerous promises. What can I do? She asked me. I was so annoyed that this was not a real case. I replied, lady, this guy is in heck laughing at you right now. I wish I had been more sensitive to get the real whole story. Before I was a lawyer, I had a part-time gig sifting through probate records for unclaimed assets. No specific file sticks out, but I think 1 in 50 or so records had really explicit notes regarding why so and so was left out of the will. This is done to make it more difficult to contest. Not a lawyer, people I know. The husband father was a real difficult, controlling, badass rich self-made farmer and assumed he will definitely die before his wife. He thus worded the will in terms of the first to die and the longest living etc. Translating from Afrikaans here, so I hope the terminology is the same. He set up the will so that 2 of his farms go to his sons and everything else gets sold and go to a trust fund. His wife, the longest living, would have to go to a pre-specified retirement village and get a specified monthly stipend to live from. He did not want her to be able to be frivolous with her money. Anyways, his wife had a sudden stroke and passed away long before him. The farms went to his sons, who refused point blank to continue taking his controlling crap, and he had to go and live in the retirement village with a small monthly stipend. We all laughed our asses off for years afterwards. My grandmother was adopted and an only child. She took care of her parents until they died. A week before my great-grandfather died, the pastor from their church locked himself in the bedroom with him and had his will changed. When the will was read, it stated that my grandmother was not a person of any relation and nothing from the estate was to go to her. Also, the pastor had her adoption records destroyed so that there would be no proof of the relationship. Because of this, she never was able to find out anything about her birth family. All of his estate went to the church. Grandma was a little raw about this. Sounds like that pastor was playing a little fast and loose with his place in the afterlife. At the college I went to, there was a wealthy, eccentric alum who willed a great deal of money to the school on the condition that it only be used for research into anti-gravity technology. He had lost a number of relatives to gravity-related deaths, drowning, plane crash, etc., and went a little bit off the deep end. The school talked to his family and eventually used the money for a new science building. Part of the building included a bridge with another building, in keeping with the anti-gravity theme. Law student and paralegal. A client had previously executed a will that bequeathed a significant percentage of her estate to her husband's children. Her husband passed away, and we revised her will to remove all reference to her husband's children. I guess she was only trying to appease him whilst he was alive. Additionally, all of her jewelry that was going to go to her husband's daughter ended up going to her housemaid. My mother's father's will apparently made the lawyer a bit uncomfortable to read out. They were a farming family, with 3 daughters. He thought my grandmother was a nice piece of butt and was paranoid about all the suitors upon his demise. He left the farm to his wife, but their house to the daughters with the stipulation that the wife be allowed to live there, unless she remarried. She sold the farm and used that to buy the house off my mother and her sisters. She didn't remarry, but she wasn't going to let anyone control her either. My old man does an awful lot of probate law. I do a bit of it. The thing about it is, most people just leave to family. They might fall out, and that's never fun. But there's always a rather grim logic to it. The real fun though is always when a person dies intestate. That's when the illegitimate children crop up. About the only thing to say is that some people really are just C. Probate teaches you that much. Intestate, not having made a will before one dies. My mom's father left her and her 3 sisters $1 out of spite. $1. Just don't leave anything, you fricking dong. My grandfather was very well off from being a successful insurance salesman. He left his wife and 4 daughters to start a new life with another woman and her daughters way before I was born. Leaving a token amount to the person is some sort of legal thingy, to the effect that the disinherited or cheated person can't say they were forgotten or overlooked. They weren't overlooked, they got $1, so it would be harder to contest. My father is executor of a will for a childless couple that died one after the other. The will left the house to 2 cats. The house cannot be sold until the cats die. One was a kitten at the time. We had this old aunt who was despicable. She was full of evil, and when I was young and pretty much behaved perfectly, she once locked me in her bathroom for absolutely no freaking reason at all. My family would search for me and she would pretend she didn't know where I am, and it is one of the most horrific experiences of my life. My mother hated her and once fed her cat food telling her it was foie gras or some crap. Anyways, she had a change of heart later on and she was pretty okay, gave me her gigantic Matchbox collection, and she would always give me lots of money. Let's say 20 euros when I was like 8 or 9, which I think is a lot for a 9-year-old that really only needs money to buy bubblegums. So having put that into context, she said in her will, X can have this, Y can have this, this goes to Z. As for the rest, kill yourselves to take them. It never dawned on me how freaking weird she was until now. My parents will set aside $0.08 per year for the care and feeding of a weird pineapple-shaped cactus that they named Sideshow Bob. I work in the legal industry. I am familiar with a matter where the deceased children, father, were only entitled to their share of distribution if they attended his funeral and converted to the Catholic Church. If not, their share would be distributed to his other children of a second marriage. The first children made a claim that it was ambiguous as they attended the funeral but did not convert. Question of if it was inclusive, and that it's against public policy to make a person change their religion for a gift, and the concept that you cannot rule from the grave. The court upheld the father had the right to create that clause in his will and children received nothing. Controversial, would post link to articles but don't know how. My dad's friend passed away, and before he died, he opened up a bar tab with $5,000 prepaid at the horse track where they all originally met, for his 10 or so buddies. I thought that was pretty cool. To this day they still put drinks on his tab. Not me, but a family friend had to call the cops one day after a wedding. The old guy left the majority of his fortune to a granddaughter no one knew existed, except the oldest son, who had abandoned his starter family and never looked back. That crap came back to haunt him nicely. This did not stop my sister and I from having an ongoing relationship, but upon my parents' death, we met at our parents' house, and I was discussing the family safe. My sister told me clearly that she had not been in the safe as she was unable to open it. Unbeknownst to her, the caretaker was standing right behind her and stated, "Yes, you did, L. You had the safe open this morning before B got here." She didn't say anything. I also never told my sister that one of the last serious talks my mom had with me was to make sure my sister did not cheat me out of what was meant for me upon their death. I'll never know what was in the safe, nor what other items she may have taken. After all, she may have taken nothing. But my sister is my sister, and I've always known what she is like, as, evidently, did my mom. I don't even think my grandmother had a proper will documented at the time of her death, but it was understood that my aunt, who was the elder sister, would receive the house that she lived in with her mother on her death, plus half of the block of land value that was inherited from my great-grandmother if she paid the upkeep costs, i.e. cutting the grass, and paid funeral arrangements. My mother, who was the younger of the two, would only receive half of the great-grandmother's property. My mother was totally okay with that as she had her own house, and so about 10 years later they decide to sell the shared property and split the money. My aunt then took my mother to court for the whole amount of the shared property. They were only in court for a short time, but my mum won, plus court cost. However, she managed that, and hasn't spoken to her greedy sister since. I used to work in the UK probate registry. We had one will where the testator left half a lemon to his accountant with the instructions, "Now squeeze this." If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.